The transport shuttle made a noise on descent that Corin Vase had learned to interpret as either routine mechanical complaint or imminent catastrophic failure. And after 3 years of flying in alien-manufactured vehicles, he'd developed a 50-50 accuracy rate on distinguishing between the two. Today felt like a complaining day. Probably. The viewport showed the palace growing larger, all those impossible curves and bioluminescent veins that suggested the architects had never met a right angle they didn't want to immediately complicate. Beside him, Lieutenant Rach was reviewing the ceremony notes for the 4th time, her lips moving slightly as she memorized which bow corresponded to which rank. "You know they're not actually going to execute you if you bow wrong," Vase said. "The brief says cultural sensitivity is paramount." The brief was written by someone who's never left the diplomatic corps headquarters. "Trust me, they're more interested in making sure we don't accidentally start a war than they are in perfect choreography." Rach looked unconvinced but pocketed her tablet. "Easy for you to say. You just have to stand there and look appropriately martial. It's a gift." The shuttle's landing gear deployed with a hydraulic wheeze that definitely fell on the concerning side of the spectrum, but they touched down without exploding, which Vase counted as a minor victory. The pilot, a human woman named Torres who'd flown supply runs during the Hadron's Gate mess, gave him a thumbs up through the cockpit window. He returned it, then stood and began the familiar process of checking his gear. His armor was already on, had been since they left the ship, because putting it on in front of an audience felt performative in a way he'd never been comfortable with. Each piece settled against him with the weight of old conversations. The chest plate still didn't quite sit flush after the hasty repairs on Kes 3, creating a tiny gap that whistled when he turned too quickly. The left gauntlet's thumb actuator stuck slightly, requiring an extra half-second of pressure. These weren't flaws. They were personalities. "Commander, your helmet's got that scorch mark again," Rach noted. "It's decorative. It makes you look like you lost a fight with a plasma torch." "I did lose a fight with a plasma torch. The plasma torch knows what it did." The shuttle's rear hatch opened with a pressurized hiss, revealing a welcoming committee of precisely 7 aliens, which according to the brief meant this was a formal military greeting rather than a state reception. Vase appreciated the distinction. State receptions involve small talk about trade agreements and cultural exchange programs. Military greetings involve nodding at people who understood that sometimes you just wanted to get through the day without excessive conversation. The lead figure stepped forward and Vase recognized the minor court official from the advanced briefings, a slender individual whose name translated to something like Morning Keeper of the 3rd Administrative Garden, which the brief had helpfully shortened to Keeper Tholis. The official's ears, long and gracefully pointed, twitched slightly in what might have been nervousness or possibly just a response to the shuttle's residual heat wash. "Commander Vase," Tholis said in accented but precise standard, "welcome to the sovereign palace of Unbroken Dawn. We are honored by your presence." "Thank you for having us," Vase replied, running through the approved greeting formula. "We come in the spirit of mutual cooperation and shared purpose." "Indeed. If you will follow me, we have prepared a chamber where you may, that is, where final preparations for the ceremony." Tholis paused and Vase got the distinct impression the official had just received new instructions through some kind of internal communication system. "Where you may observe the palace architecture while we finalize certain arrangements." Rach shot him a look that clearly communicated, "This is not according to the brief," but Vase just shrugged. Ceremonies always ran behind schedule. It was practically a law of physics, right up there with entropy and the speed of light. They were led through corridors that seemed designed by someone who'd read about hallways, but decided to improve on the concept. The walls curved in ways that made Vea's inner ear complain, and the bioluminescent veins pulsed with rhythms that might have been aesthetic or might have been the alien equivalent of a heartbeat. He'd stopped trying to understand architectural philosophy after the Turin embassy, which had been built entirely underwater for reasons no one had adequately explained. The preparation chamber turned out to be circular, which was at least a shape Vase recognized. Tholis gestured around the space with obvious pride. "Here you may refresh yourselves. There are amenities." The official indicated several alcoves that might have contained anything from furniture to decorative plants. "And the ceremony will commence within the hour." "Appreciated," Vase said. Thulis hesitated at the doorway. Commander, if I may, your armor, the markings, are they, standard human military designation? Vase glanced down at his chest plate, at the small carved symbols he'd stopped really seeing years ago. No, personal notation. Just helps me remember things. I see. Most interesting. Tholis's ears twitched again. Most interesting indeed. Then the official was gone, and Vase was alone in a circular room that he was increasingly certain had transparent walls. He'd been in enough observation chambers to recognize the feeling of being watched, that peculiar pressure at the back of his neck that came from unseen eyes. He considered waving at whoever might be observing, decided that would be unprofessional, and instead began his standard equipment check. The ritual was always the same. Start at the top, work down. Helmet, check the seals, make sure the heads-up display wasn't fritzing again. Gorget, ensure the articulation points weren't binding. Pauldrons, chest plate, gauntlets, each one receiving a moment of attention. Not because he didn't trust the gear, but because the gear deserved to be trusted, and trust without verification was just hope wearing a uniform. His fingers found the memorial seal on his left shoulder blade without conscious thought. The mark for the civilian evacuation at Hadron's Gate, where they'd held the spaceport for 16 hours against an advancing army that didn't care about the distinction between combatants and refugees. He'd lost 40% of his unit in those 16 hours. The civilians had made it to the ships. Worth it, he thought, the same way he always thought when his fingers found that mark. Worth every second. He moved on to the next seal, the one near his spine that commemorated the medical transport run on Kes 3. That one had been uglier, a running firefight through a collapsing city where every block held the possibility of ambush. They'd gotten the wounded out. He'd gotten most of his people out too, though the ones they'd left behind still showed up in his dreams sometimes, asking why they hadn't been worth saving. Because I couldn't, he said quietly to the empty room. Because the math didn't work. The armor didn't judge him for the confession. It never did. It just held the weight of his choices and waited for him to add more. Somewhere beyond the observation panels he couldn't quite locate, he had no way of knowing that an alien queen had stopped breathing, that a royal court had gone silent, that prophecies were being hastily retrieved from archives and dusted off for immediate relevance. He just finished his equipment check, straightened his posture out of habit, and wondered idly if the ceremony would include food. The brief hadn't mentioned food, but in his experience, the best diplomatic functions always involve something edible as a hedge against the tedium of speeches. Sesseth had been queen for 11 years, which meant she'd survived approximately 4,000 formal functions, 2 assassination attempts, and 1 particularly aggressive trade negotiation involving tariffs on synthetic proteins that had somehow devolved into a 3-day philosophical debate about the nature of value itself. She considered herself reasonably unflappable. The human standing in her observation chamber was flapping her considerably. "You're certain about the symbols," she said to archivist Mellon, who'd arrived wheezing and clutching a data tablet like it might escape if he loosened his grip. "Your Majesty, I've cross-referenced 17 historical texts, including the Codex of Thresholds, which hasn't been accessed in my entire career, and I can confirm that the markings on the human's armor correspond to memorial seals used by the ancient vigil keepers. The probability of coincidence is astronomically small, yes. You've mentioned that 3 times now." Sesseth pressed her fingers to her temples, a gesture her etiquette tutor had spent years trying to break her of. "And the prophecies?" Mellon's ears drooped apologetically. "Open to interpretation, as prophecies tend to be. But the relevant passages speak of a guardian from beyond the known stars, one who carries the weight of the saved and lost, who stands not for glory but because the alternative is unthinkable. I read the brief you sent." She had in fact skimmed it while her attendants had frantically reorganized the ceremony, but Mellon didn't need to know that. The question is what we do about it. Her prime minister, Kellys, had been uncharacteristically quiet since Sesseth's announcement. Now she spoke, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone about to say something they knew would be unpopular. "We could do nothing, Your Majesty. Proceed with the ceremony as planned. The human commander need never know what significance we've attached to his personal memorabilia. And when the outer colonies hear that we met a prophesied guardian and treated him like a minor diplomatic courtesy, Sesseth turned to face her advisor. How long before someone decides we've forsaken the old ways, that the throne has grown too disconnected from the people? The outer colonies are always finding reasons to complain. It's practically their cultural identity at this point. They're also the ones who kept the old texts alive when we decided prophecy was embarrassing. Ignoring this feels like asking for problems we don't need. Sesseth looked back through the observation panel, where Vase was now checking his helmet with the focus of someone who'd performed the same action 10,000 times. Besides, there's the small matter of it possibly being true. Kellis raised one elegantly arched eyebrow. You believe in prophecy now? I believe in not dismissing evidence just because it's inconvenient. That man is wearing symbols our ancestors considered sacred, performing rituals we thought were mythology, and he has no idea what any of it means. Either that's the most elaborate coincidence in galactic history, or we're looking at something significant. Or, offered her military advisor, General Torith, who'd been examining the human through a tactical lens. He's simply a soldier who developed his own system of remembrance that happens to resemble ours. Convergent cultural evolution. It happens. With 17 distinct symbols matching our historical records, including the threshold mark that we haven't used since the Collapse Wars? Toreth conceded the point with a slight dip of his head. Unlikely. I'll grant you unlikely. Through the panel, Vase had finished his inspection and was now standing with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. Sesseth found herself cataloging details, the way he distributed his weight evenly, suggesting readiness to move in any direction, the slight tilt of his head that kept his peripheral vision clear, the casual competence of someone who'd survived enough fights to know the difference between alertness and paranoia. Her people had generals and champions, warriors who'd trained their entire lives in the art of combat. This human looked like he'd learned warfare the hard way and hadn't particularly enjoyed the education. Keeper Thalas, she said, activating the comm channel to the preparation chamber's attendant. How long has the commander been waiting? Approximately 12 minutes, Your Majesty. And he hasn't complained? Asked questions? Demanded to know why the ceremony's been delayed? No, Your Majesty. He appears content to wait. Sesseth made a small humming sound that her closest advisors recognized as her thinking noise. Interesting. Most humans I've met have a limited tolerance for unexplained delays. Perhaps he's simply disciplined, Kellis suggested. Or perhaps he's used to plans changing without warning, Torith countered. Combat develops that particular flexibility. Meln clutched his tablet tighter. Your Majesty, if I may, the protocols for receiving a prophesied guardian are extensive and somewhat theatrical. There's ritual purification, symbolic offerings, the recitation of the 7 acknowledgments, and absolutely none of that is happening, Sesseth said firmly. I'm not subjecting the man to a religious ceremony he didn't sign up for. We'll adjust our approach, honor what we've discovered without forcing him into a role he doesn't understand. She paused, struck by a thought. Does he even know about our prophecies? The cultural brief prepared for the human delegation made no mention of our spiritual traditions, Kellis confirmed. We thought it might complicate the diplomatic framework. Wonderful. So we're about to treat him as a significant religious figure based on prophecies he's never heard of, honoring symbols he created independently without knowing what they meant to us. This is either profound or absurd, and I'm not certain which. Could be both, Your Majesty, offered Torith. The universe has a sense of humor. A terrible one, apparently. Sesseth straightened. Decision made. Change of plans. We're not doing the ceremonial hall. Bring him to the Hall of Remembrance instead. Her entire court went silent. The Hall of Remembrance was where they honored the fallen, where the names of the lost were inscribed in light-carved crystal that would outlast the star their world orbited. It wasn't a place for diplomatic functions. It wasn't even a place for celebration. It was sacred in a way that transcended politics. Your Majesty, Kellis said carefully, that's bold. It's appropriate. If his armor carries memorial seals, he should see how we honor our own. We'll make it a cultural exchange. Show him our traditions, see how he responds. If the prophecies mean anything, he'll understand. If they don't, we've just given him a tour of a historically significant building. And if he asks why we're showing him specifically, we tell him the truth, that we recognize the weight he carries and want to honor it properly. No need to mention prophecy or threshold guardians or any of that unless he asks. Sesseth smiled, an expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. We're very good at saying true things without mentioning all the context. It's practically our specialty as a civilization. Melon was frantically scrolling through his tablet. The Hall of Remembrance protocols don't include provisions for foreign military personnel. I'm not sure. Archivist, with all respect for your dedication to proper procedure, I really don't care about protocols right now. We're in uncharted territory. We navigate as best we can. She looked back at Vase, who'd found something to examine on his left gauntlet with deep focus. Besides, something tells me he's not particularly concerned with following official procedures either. He does appear remarkably comfortable with ambiguity, Torith noted. That's what happens when you survive situations where the official plans stop being relevant somewhere around minute 5. Sesseth had read the after-action reports from Hadron's Gate, the clinical language that tried and failed to disguise the absolute chaos of holding a spaceport against impossible odds. The man standing in her preparation chamber had kept 3,000 civilians alive long enough to evacuate. The fact that he'd done it wearing armor covered in memorial seals suddenly felt less like coincidence and more like evidence of a universe that occasionally aligned in unexpected ways. Your Majesty, the human delegation will expect the ceremony we promised, Kellis reminded her. His superiors will have briefed him. Changing the format might cause diplomatic complications. Then we'll handle the complications. Tell his lieutenant that there's been a modification to honor the commander's service record more appropriately. Make it sound like we're doing him a favor, which, depending on your perspective, we are. Sesseth stepped back from the observation panel. Decision made and momentum building. And someone please make sure the hall is ready to receive guests. If we're doing this, we're doing it properly. Her court scattered to implement orders, leaving Sesseth alone with her thoughts and the view of a human soldier who had no idea his quiet act of remembrance had just rewritten the diplomatic agenda for an entire civilization. Vase had been standing in the circular room for approximately 20 minutes when Keeper Thalos returned, this time accompanied by 2 guards whose armor suggested they were significantly more important than basic ceremonial decoration. The officials' ears were doing that twitching thing again, which Vase had started to interpret as the alien equivalent of barely suppressed anxiety. Commander Vase, there has been a slight adjustment to the schedule. Define slight, Vase said, because in his experience, slight adjustments range from minor inconveniences to complete operational overhauls, and the guard's presence suggested this might lean toward the latter. The Queen has requested that, instead of the formal ceremony, you be given a tour of the Hall of Remembrance. It is a great honor, a profound honor. Really, the significance cannot be overstated. Vase waited for additional context, received none, and decided to ask the practical question. Is there still going to be food? Tholis blinked, a slow, confused gesture that involved more of the face than human blinking required. Food? The brief mentioned a reception. Receptions usually involve small consumables arranged on plates. I'm just trying to calibrate my expectations. Yes, I believe refreshments will be available following the tour. Thalos rallied admirably. But the hall itself is truly remarkable. Our most sacred space. The Queen specifically requested you be shown. Got it. Sacred space. Great honor. Possibly food afterward. Lead the way. The guards exchanged a look that Vase couldn't quite interpret, but Thalos seemed relieved to be moving forward. They exited the circular room and entered a new series of corridors, these ones noticeably different from the earlier architectural adventures. The bioluminescent veins had changed color, shifting from amber to a deep blue-white that reminded Vase uncomfortably of ice fields at dawn. The walls here were smoother, carved with patterns that might have been decorative or might have been text in some script he didn't recognize. The hall was built during the Reconstruction period, Thalos explained, falling into what Vase recognized as tour guide mode. After the collapse wars, when we needed to remember what we'd lost while building what would come next. Sounds familiar, Vase said, thinking of the memorial gardens on New Harmony, where the names of the dead from the separation conflicts were still being added decades after the fighting stopped. Every civilization seemed to go through the same cycle. Fight, lose people, build something to make sure the loss meant something. He'd never decided if that made the species he'd encountered admirably persistent or just tragically slow learners. They reached a massive door that appeared to be grown rather than constructed, its surface flowing with the same bioluminescent patterns as the corridors, but concentrated into something approaching art. The guards took positions on either side, and Tholis placed one hand against a panel that Vase hadn't noticed. There was a sound like wind chimes made of glass, and the door began to open with the kind of dramatic slowness that suggested someone had calibrated it for maximum emotional impact. "The Hall of Remembrance," Tholis announced and stepped aside. Vase walked through and immediately understood why they'd changed the schedule. The space beyond wasn't a hall in any conventional sense. It was a cathedral of light and memory, vast enough to hold several thousand people comfortably, with a ceiling that rose into darkness, punctuated by points of illumination that mimicked stars. The walls were covered in what he'd initially thought were decorative panels, but quickly realized were something far more significant. Names. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, carved into crystal that held light like captured sunlight, each one glowing softly in the dimness. "These are the fallen," Tholis said quietly. "Every name carved here represents someone who gave their life so others could continue. We add to it still, as new losses occur." Vase approached the nearest wall and looked at the names, the alien script flowing in patterns he couldn't read but understood perfectly anyway. He'd seen similar memorials on a dozen worlds, had stood before human versions with the same weight in his chest. The details changed: crystal versus stone, carved script versus holographic projection. But the fundamental truth remained constant. People died protecting other people, and the ones who survived carved their names into permanence, because forgetting felt like a second death. "It's well done," he said finally, "because what else could you say about grief made architectural?" "The Queen thought you might appreciate it, given..." Tholis gestured vaguely at Vase's armor. That made Vase turn and look at the official more carefully. "Given what?" Tholis's ears did a complicated dance of uncertainty. "Your armor. The markings. We noticed they appear to be memorial notation. You noticed that from looking at me in a circular room for 20 minutes? The observation panels are quite sophisticated, and the Queen is very observant." Vase processed this information and arrived at the conclusion that he'd been put on display like some kind of exhibit, examined by alien royalty, who'd apparently decided his personal coping mechanisms were interesting enough to warrant special attention. He considered being offended, decided it would take too much energy, and settled for mild resignation instead. "So this is what? A bonding exercise? Show the human with the sad armor your sad room, see if he gets emotional?" Tholis looked genuinely distressed. "No! The Queen wished to honor your service appropriately. When she saw the memorial seals you carry, she felt the formal ceremony would be insufficient recognition." "My memorial seals?" "Yes, the sacred marks of..." Tholis caught himself. "The marks on your armor? They're memorial seals, yes? Commemorating those you've protected?" Vase looked down at his chest plate, at the small carved symbols he'd added over 3 years of fighting, in conflicts that probably didn't matter in any cosmic sense, but had mattered intensely to the people trying not to die during them. He'd never called them memorial seals. He'd never called them anything, really. They were just marks, personal notation, a way of keeping score in a game where the only winning move was making sure someone else got to walk away. "They're a reminder," he said. "Places I've been, things I've done, people I couldn't save. But you saved others. Sometimes, when the math worked out." Tholis made a sound that might have been a sigh. "Commander, in our culture, the marking of memorial seals was a sacred practice of the vigil keepers, warriors who stood so others might live. The tradition died out centuries ago, considered too painful to maintain. Seeing it again, seeing it carried by someone who doesn't even know what it means to us." The official's voice trailed off. "The Queen thought you deserved to see how we honor the same burden." Vase stood in the Hall of Remembrance, surrounded by names carved in crystal, and felt the universe click into one of those moments of unexpected connection that made interspecies diplomacy occasionally worthwhile, instead of just exhausting. These people, with their impossible architecture and their long ears and their bioluminescent aesthetic choices, understood the weight. They'd built a room for it. They kept adding names to the walls because forgetting wasn't an option. "All right," he said, "show me." Tholas's relief was visible. "The Queen herself will provide the tour. She's waiting near the central memorial." "The Queen is giving me a personal tour." "Yes, she felt it appropriate." "Because of my armor." "Because of what your armor represents?" "Yes." Vase considered the diplomatic implications of an alien monarch personally escorting a mid-level human commander through a sacred cultural site, decided that was well above his pay grade to analyze, and shrugged. "Lead on then. Try not to let me accidentally insult anyone's ancestors." "The ancestors are quite understanding, I'm assured. It's the living you need to worry about." They walked deeper into the hall, past walls covered in names that glowed like captured starlight, and Vase found himself reading the patterns, even though he couldn't understand the script. Each name told a story. Each one represented a choice someone made to stand when running would have been easier. He recognized that story. He'd been living it for 3 years, ever since Hadron's Gate taught him that sometimes holding the line was the only thing between civilians and catastrophe. Ahead, in the center of the hall, where the ceiling opened to show actual stars instead of simulated ones, a figure waited. Tall, slender, with ears that rose in elegant points and robes that seemed to shift color in the strange light. The Queen, presumably, because guards didn't stand quite that formally for anyone else. Vase checked his armor one last time, a habit he couldn't break, and felt his fingers brush against the memorial seal near his spine. The mark for holding the line alone, the one he'd carved after Kess 3, when the math had been particularly brutal and the choices had been particularly stark. The Queen turned as they approached, and Vase got his first clear look at her face. She looked young for a monarch, though he had no idea how alien aging worked, with eyes that suggested she missed exactly nothing and an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been something more complicated. "Commander Vase," she said, her standard flawless. "Thank you for accepting our invitation. I hope the change in schedule wasn't too disruptive." "I'm adaptable," Vase replied, which was true and also the most diplomatic way of saying he'd learned to expect plans to fall apart. "Excellent. Then let me show you how we remember." Sesseth had given tours before. Diplomatic visitors, scholarly delegations, once a group of particularly insistent artists who'd wanted to paint the memorial crystals and had required careful redirection toward less sacred subjects. None of those experiences had prepared her for walking through the Hall of Remembrance with a human soldier who kept stopping to examine the walls with the focus of someone reading familiar text in an unfamiliar language. "This section here," Vase said, gesturing to a cluster of names arranged in concentric circles, "are these grouped by incident or by unit?" "Incident. The inner circle fell during the initial defense. The outer rings held the evacuation point." She watched his face, saw the recognition there. "You've seen similar patterns." "Hadron's Gate. We lost the inner perimeter in the first 6 hours. The outer positions held for another 10 while the civilians loaded." He touched the crystal lightly, his scarred fingers gentle against the glowing surface. "Same math, different species." They moved on, past walls that chronicled centuries of loss organized into careful categories. Medical transports lost. Rearguard actions. Last stands that bought time measured in minutes that meant everything to the people who gained those minutes. Sesseth watched Vase read the patterns, saw him nod occasionally in recognition of tactical situations that transcended culture. "Your people fought a lot of defensive actions," he observed. "The collapse wars were mostly about holding what we had while trying to evacuate non-combatants. We lost entire colonies, billions of lives." She stopped at a wall that held more names than any other section. "This is from the fall of Kessin, our agricultural heartworld. We held the evacuation zones for 3 weeks while the enemy tried to trap the civilian fleet. How many got out? 82%. And the defenders? 12% survived." Vase was quiet for a moment, his hand finding the memorial seal near his spine without conscious thought. Seth had been watching for that gesture, the way he touched certain marks when confronted with specific losses. The man carried his own walls of names, carved into armor instead of crystal, but serving the same fundamental purpose. "Your Majesty," he said finally, "I appreciate the tour, and this is genuinely impressive. But I'm getting the feeling there's context I'm missing." Seth had been waiting for this question. "What makes you think that?" "Because queens don't personally escort mid-level commanders through sacred cultural sites unless there's a reason beyond general hospitality. And Keeper Thalas has been radiating nervous energy since we arrived, which suggests something significant is happening that I'm not aware of." He turned to face her fully. "So what am I missing?" She appreciated his directness. "Your armor. The memorial seals you carry. They match patterns we thought were lost to history. Tholas mentioned that, said they were sacred to some ancient warrior tradition. The Vigil Keepers, guardians who stood so others could live. They marked each action, each loss, each choice that bought time for evacuation or survival. The practice ended centuries ago, considered too painful to maintain, but the prophecy said it would return when—" She caught herself, decided honesty was more diplomatic than evasion. "When we needed it most. When a guardian from beyond the known stars would come carrying the old marks without knowing their significance." Vase stared at her. "You're saying I accidentally fulfilled a prophecy. That's one interpretation. What's the other interpretation? That you independently develop practices identical to our most sacred warrior traditions, including symbols we haven't used in 700 years, through pure coincidence? Both options are somewhat improbable." He looked down at his armor, at the marks he'd carved in quiet moments between conflicts, and laughed. It was a short, slightly disbelieving sound that echoed oddly in the vast space. "I marked my armor because I needed to remember, because if I didn't write it down somewhere permanent, the missions would blur together, and the people I lost would stop being individuals and become statistics. That's not prophecy. That's just trying not to forget. And that," Seth said quietly, "is exactly what the prophecies describe. A guardian who carries the weight not because of destiny or divine calling, but because the alternative, forgetting, allowing the lost to become numbers, is unthinkable." She gestured at the walls around them. "We built this hall for the same reason, because names carved in crystal can't be reduced to casualty reports." Vase walked to the nearest wall and stood there, his reflection ghosting across names that glowed with captured light. "So what happens now? Do I need to do something? Fulfill some ancient obligation? Lead your people into battle against prophesied darkness?" "Ancestors, no. That would be terrible for diplomatic relations." Seth joined him at the wall. "What happens now is we acknowledge a truth. You carry weight we recognize. You fight the way our ancient guardians fought. Whether that's prophecy or coincidence doesn't actually matter. What matters is that my people, especially the outer colonies who kept these traditions alive, will see you as significant. And that changes things." "Changes them how?" "Politically, it makes you someone we listen to rather than someone we tolerate for diplomatic courtesy. Militarily, it means when you tell us something is important, we believe you. Culturally," she smiled, "it means you're probably going to get invited to a lot more ceremonies, and I apologize in advance for that." "Fantastic. I already attend too many ceremonies. And consider it the price of accidentally being prophetically significant." Seth started walking again, leading him toward the central memorial where the ceiling opened to show real stars. "But there's a practical element too. The outer colonies have been pushing for greater autonomy, arguing that the core worlds have forgotten the principles that kept our civilization alive during the collapse wars. Having you, someone who embodies those principles without even knowing it, standing beside the throne sends a message. That you're honoring the old ways. That we never forgot them, even when we stopped talking about them explicitly. Politics is partly theater, Commander. You're good theater." They reached the central memorial, a crystal formation that rose toward the open ceiling like a frozen flame. Names covered every surface, arranged in spirals that drew the eye upward toward the stars. Seseth placed her hand against the base and felt the subtle vibration of the memorial's power core, the technology that kept the names glowing for generations. We add new names every year, she said. Border conflicts, rescue operations gone wrong, patrol ships lost to navigation errors or equipment failures. The fighting hasn't stopped just because we call it peace now. She looked at Vase. Your armor will run out of space eventually. What happens then? He considered the question seriously. I haven't thought that far ahead. Maybe I retire before it becomes a problem. Or maybe you start a second set. Build a memorial that outlasts the armor. She gestured at the crystal around them. This is our solution. Permanence through technology. Your marks are permanent too, but they're tied to equipment that will eventually fail. Everything eventually fails. The trick is making sure it matters before it does. Pragmatic. Realistic. I've seen too many grand monuments to ideals that didn't help the people they were supposed to protect. These names, my marks, they're functional. They exist to be remembered, not to inspire future generations to vague nobility. Seseth found herself liking this human more than she'd anticipated. You'd get along with my military advisors. They have similar opinions about the difference between symbolic gestures and practical action. Your Majesty, with respect, I'm not here to get along with your advisors. I'm here because someone decided our governments should smile at each other while we both prepare for the next crisis we're pretending won't happen. He met her eyes. So let's skip the part where we pretend this is just cultural exchange. What do you actually want from me? Direct question, deserving of direct answer. I want you to keep doing what you're already doing. Hold the line when it needs holding. Protect civilians when they need protecting. Carry the weight publicly instead of hiding it. She paused. And occasionally attend ceremonies because my political situation requires theater even when we both know it's theater. That's it? No grand alliance? No binding my service to your throne? No prophetic obligations? Commander, if I tried to bind you to anything, you'd tell me no and probably return to your ship immediately. You're not someone who responds well to obligation. She smiled. But you respond very well to people needing protection. So I'm simply making sure you know that if situations arise where your particular talents are needed, we'd welcome the assistance. Vase was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he nodded slowly. That I can work with. No promises beyond doing my job. But if your people need help, I'm not opposed to providing it. Excellent. Then we have an understanding. Seseth stepped back from the memorial. Now the political theater portion of the evening. I need to present you to my court, acknowledge your service formally, and make sure everyone sees that the throne recognizes your significance. Try not to look too uncomfortable during the speeches. No promises there either. I'll keep them short. Well, shorter. There are protocols. She started back toward the hall's entrance. And afterward, there will be food, actual food, not just symbolic offerings. My chef prepared something supposedly compatible with human digestion. Supposedly. We tested it on 3 volunteers from your ship. They all survived and reported it was acceptable. Your diplomatic standards are refreshingly low. They walked back through the hall, past walls of names that continued glowing in the darkness. Each one a reminder that protection always came at a cost, and that remembering mattered more than comfortable amnesia. Vase touched his armor occasionally, his fingers finding marks that meant something different, now that he knew others had carried similar weight centuries before. We tested it on 3 volunteers from your ship. They all survived and reported it was acceptable. Your diplomatic standards are refreshingly low. They walked back through the hall, past walls of names that continued glowing in the darkness. Each one a reminder that protection always came at a cost, and that remembering mattered more than comfortable amnesia. Vase touched his armor occasionally, his fingers finding marks that meant something different, now that he knew others had carried similar weight centuries before. At the entrance, Keeper Thalas waited with visible relief. Your Majesty, the court is assembled. Commander, your lieutenant is waiting to brief you on the modified ceremony format. Modified how? Vase asked. There are additional speeches and a ceremonial presentation. Also, the Prime Minister prepared remarks about cross-cultural military cooperation and how long will this take? Thalas hesitated. 2 hours approximately. Vase looked at Seseth. 2 hours? I did warn you about ceremonies. Consider it the universe's revenge for accidentally being prophetically significant. The universe has a terrible sense of humor. You're only just realizing this now? They entered the corridor leading back toward the ceremonial spaces, leaving the Hall of Remembrance behind but carrying its weight forward. Somewhere ahead, a court full of aliens waited to acknowledge a human soldier who'd carved memorial seals into armor because forgetting felt wrong, who'd stood at Hadron's gate for 16 hours because the math required it, who'd never thought of himself as fulfilling prophecy because he was too busy trying not to fail the people who needed him. Seth watched him walk, saw the way he moved with the certainty of someone who'd made peace with carrying weight others couldn't see, and thought her ancestors might have been onto something with their prophecies. Not because Vase was destined or chosen or specially anointed, but because some people simply couldn't walk away when others needed protection, and those people would always find each other across the gaps between stars. The ceremony would be tedious. The speeches would be too long, but the weight would be acknowledged, and that mattered. Everything else was just theater.